All right, let's go to our to-dos component. So to-dos.ts. So here we have a basic to-dos component. Now in the component metadata, we're going to add a new property, animations. And we set this to an array. In this array, we define one or more triggers. So we call the trigger function, which comes in Angular/animations library. Let's import this on the top. And by the way, look here, we have a couple of options. One is to import this from Angular/animations. The other is to import it from Angular/core. Initially, the animation functions were part of the core Angular module. But starting from version 4 or 4.1, I don't exactly remember, Angular team moved these functions into a different module called Angular/animations. So be sure to import all these functions from Angular/animations. Okay. Now here we need to give this trigger a name. So let's call this fade. And then as a second argument, we need to pass an array. In this array, we register all the states and the transitions to implement this animation. Okay? So we have a trigger called fade. Before going any further, let's go to our template and apply this trigger. So todos.html. So this is where we render all the to-do items. Each to-do item is a button, and here you can see I've applied the ng4 directive. So I'm going to apply our trigger using this notation, @, and then the name of the trigger, fade. Okay? If you don't do this, you're not going to see the animation. Okay? So back in the component. Now here in this array, we need to register all the states and the transitions for this animation. So we often have calls to two functions. One is the state function, and the other is transition. Again, both these functions are defined in Angular/animations. So let's quickly import them from Angular/animations. Now it's easier to start with this transition function. So I'm going to temporarily delete this line, and we'll come back to it later. Now, this transition function requires two arguments. The first one is a string, and this is what we call a state change expression. With this expression, we define the source and the target states. So here's an example. Void goes to default. That means when our element goes from the void state to the default state, then here we add an array. And in this array, we define the steps that should run during this animation. Okay? So in order to implement a fade-in effect, we want to apply certain styles during this transition when the element is created, but it's not placed in the DOM yet. Here, often we have calls to two functions. One is the style function, and the other is the animate function. What are these? Well, first of all, let's import both of these from Angular/animations. Okay. Starting with the style function. This function takes an object, and this object contains one or more key value pairs where keys are CSS properties. So if I want to change the background color of this element during this transition, I can set that here. Background color to yellow. I can also set the opacity here. Opacity 0. So this style function will apply these styles here immediately during this transition. Okay? Now the animate function is similar, but it takes two arguments. The first argument is the timing. So let's say 2000 milliseconds. And the second argument is the style object. So I'm going to apply two styles. Background color, white, and opacity 1. So this animate function will apply these styles over this period of time, in this case 2 seconds. That's the only difference between the style and animate functions. The style function applies the styles immediately, but the animate function applies them over a period of time. So when we run this code, the background color of our element is going to be initially yellow, and then over 2 seconds, it will gradually change to white. Also, similarly, their opacity will be initially 0, and then it will gradually change to 1. Let's see this in action. Save, back in the browser, refresh. Okay, look, our items initially had a yellow background, but that changed to white over 2 seconds. Now back to our component, let's make this code a little bit cleaner. Here on line 12, where we call the animate function, we can totally delete the second argument. We don't need to explicitly tell Angular to change the background color to white and the opacity to 1. Because Angular is smart enough to know that in the target state, which is the default state here, our items should have a white background and their opacity should be 1. So we don't need to explicitly specify them here. So let's delete the call to the style function. Okay, that's cleaner. So here's the lesson. In the list of steps in a transition, if you have a call to the animate function with only a timing value without any styles, this animate function is going to undo all the previous styles applied over this period of time. So because earlier we changed the style of our to-do items, this animate function is going to make any necessary changes to undo these styles. Okay? Also, for the fade effect, we don't really need this background color. I just added this as a demonstration. So here's how we implement the fadeIn effect. When an element transitions from the void state to the default state, initially, we want to set its opacity to 0, which will make this element invisible. And then over a period of time, in this case, 2 seconds, we want to change that opacity to 1, which will make the element appear on the view.